Not metaphorically, literally. 67 Japanese cities had been firebombed by B-29 superfortresses flying virtually unopposed at altitude. The Imperial Navy was gone. The Army Air Force was hemorrhaging pilots faster than it could train them. And somewhere in the mountains of Nagano Prefecture, deep inside a tunnel carved into solid rock, engineers were racing to finish what many believed was Japan's last real hope in the sky. Not a kamikaze, not a suicide boat, a jet aircraft. To understand what was happening inside that tunnel, you have to understand how catastrophically Japan's air war had collapsed by late 1944. Japan had entered the war with some of the finest naval aviators on Earth, men who had trained for years, who had mastered the Mitsubishi A6M0 with a precision that shocked American and British pilots in the opening months of the Pacific War. But the Zero, for all its legendary maneuverability, was a design philosophy born of a different era. It sacrificed pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for range and agility. That trade-off worked in 1941. By 1944, it was killing Japanese pilots by the hundreds. American aircraft had evolved rapidly. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was purpose-built to kill the Zero, the Lockheed P-38, the Vought F-4U Corsair, and eventually the P-51 Mustang operating from Iwo Jima, was systematically dismantling Japanese air power over the home islands. Meanwhile, Boeing's B-29 Superfortress flew at altitudes most Japanese interceptors simply could not reach in time, and with a speed that made interception a near impossible mathematics problem. Japan's military establishment understood, perhaps later than it should have, that piston-engine aircraft had reached their operational ceiling. The only path to reclaiming air superiority, or even air parity, was jet propulsion. Germany had already demonstrated this. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was operational by mid-1944. Japan had limited but real intelligence on German jet developments, and through the Axis Technical Exchange Program, some information on turbojet technology had filtered back to Tokyo. But Japan faced a problem Germany did not. Germany had Carl Zeiss optics, precision machine tooling, and an industrial base capable of producing complex alloy components at scale. Japan, strangled by American submarines that were sinking her supply convoys at a devastating rate, lacked the raw materials and industrial precision to simply copy what the Germans had done. Japanese engineers would have to improvise. And what they produced, under conditions of almost unimaginable difficulty, was the Nakajima Kika. The Kika, which translates roughly as orange blossom, was Japan's first jet-powered aircraft. The name was deliberately innocuous, a layer of bureaucratic camouflage over a program that the Imperial Japanese Navy considered one of its most critical secret projects of the war's final phase. The formal order came in September 1944. The Navy issued a specification calling for a jet-powered attack aircraft capable of striking Allied naval vessels, particularly the growing fleet of carriers that were now operating dangerously close to Japanese home waters. The operational concept borrowed heavily from Germany's Messerschmitt Me-262, not in direct technical copying, but in philosophy. A swept-wing twin-engine jet that could outrun conventional interceptors, strike fast, and disengage before enemy fighters could respond. The project was assigned to Nakajima Aircraft Company, which had already proven itself as Japan's most capable airframe manufacturer. Two engineers were placed at the heart of the design effort, Kenichi Matsumura and Kazuo Ono. These were not aviation romantics. They were pragmatists working under military pressure with a material supply chain that was fragmenting around them. The design brief was demanding. The Navy wanted an aircraft that could reach 430 knots, carry a single 800-kilogram bomb, and operate from dispersed airfields, including strips that had been deliberately shortened to complicate American targeting. That last requirement would prove to have critical implications for how the aircraft was eventually configured. The engine problem was the first and most fundamental crisis. Japan had no operational turbojet in production. German technical documents had provided some reference data on the BMW-003 axial flow turbojet, but the documents were incomplete, and Japan's metallurgical capabilities made direct reproduction of the German engine impossible. Nakajima's engineers developed their own engine, designated the NE-20. A centrifugal outflow turbojet that drew conceptual inspiration from the BMW-03, but was substantially redesigned to work within Japan's manufacturing constraints. The NE-20 produced approximately 475 kilograms of thrust. For context, the Me-262's Junkers Jumo 004 produced roughly 900 kilograms per engine. Japan's jet was flying at half the power of its German contemporary, and it needed two of them just to get the airframe into the sky. The implications were serious. The Kika would be underpowered. Its swept wings, set at a modest 30-degree angle, were designed to compensate partially for the thrust deficit. But the engineers understood they were building an aircraft that would be marginal in performance, even under ideal conditions. In Japan's deteriorating wartime reality, ideal conditions did not exist. Construction of the first prototype began in earnest in early 1945. Nakajima's main facilities were by this point under constant threat of American air attack. B-29 raids on Japanese industrial centers had already struck several key manufacturing sites. The decision was made to disperse production and, critically, to use natural terrain as protection. This is where the cave enters the story. The Matsushiro underground complex in Nagano Prefecture had been under construction since late 1944. Initially intended as a shelter for the Imperial General Headquarters, in anticipation of an Allied invasion, but portions of the tunnel network were adapted for industrial use, including aviation component manufacturing. Work on Kika components was moved into these dispersed, protected facilities, precisely because conventional factory buildings had become death traps. The irony was profound. Japan's most advanced aircraft, the machine that was supposed to represent the technological future of Japanese air power, was being built in a tunnel by engineers working under flickering lights with tools that were increasingly difficult to replace. The first completed airframe was transported to Kisarazu Naval Air Base on the coast of Tokyo Bay. Kisarazu had been selected as the primary test site because of its longer runway and its relative accessibility for Navy oversight. The base was also home to experienced naval aviators who could provide evaluation feedback. The man chosen to fly the Kika was Lieutenant Commander Susumu Takaoka. He was a veteran naval aviator with significant test flight experience, and his selection was not accidental. The Navy needed someone who could manage the specific demands of jet-powered flight, which was entirely unlike anything Japanese pilots had encountered. There were no two-seat trainers, no gradual familiarization program. Takaoka would climb into an aircraft with a fundamentally different power delivery. No propeller torque to manage, but also no propeller-driven slipstream over the control surfaces at low speed, and take it off a runway essentially cold. The date was August 7, 1945, one day after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. The timing was not coincidence in any operational sense. The test had been scheduled, but the juxtaposition is historically arresting. Japan's most technologically advanced aircraft made its first flight on the same calendar page as the event that would end the war. Takaoka's first flight lasted approximately 20 minutes. By the accounts that survived the war, the Kika flew. It was controllable. The Ni-20 engines performed within expected parameters. The aircraft demonstrated the basic airworthiness that the engineers had hoped for. Though Takaoka and the observing engineers understood clearly that this was a first flight, not a performance demonstration, the problems were apparent even on that first sortie. The Ni-20 engines were slow to spool up from idle, a characteristic of early centrifugal turbojets that created dangerous situations during the takeoff roll and during any attempted gore. The aircraft was also sensitive on approach, where the absence of propeller slipstream made the controls feel different from what Japanese pilots had trained on their entire careers. But it had flown. That mattered. The second flight, attempted on August 11, 1945, ended before it began. During the takeoff roll, Takaoka found the aircraft was not accelerating as expected. The Rado bottles, the jet-assisted takeoff rockets mounted under the wings to compensate for the Ni-20's sluggish thrust, had been loaded incorrectly. The angles were wrong. Instead of providing the additional push down the runway, the rockets fired at an angle that created a pitch-up moment the aircraft could not sustain at low speed. The Kika left the runway prematurely, stalled, and came down hard. The airframe was damaged. Takaoka survived, but the prototype was out of action. It never flew again. 4 days later, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito delivered his recorded surrender address. The war was over when American technical teams arrived in Japan as part of the occupation. They found the Kika program in various states of completion. The damaged first prototype was recovered. A second prototype was in an advanced state of construction, and there were further airframes in various stages of assembly at dispersed production sites. Beyond the basic Kika attack variant, Nakajima had been developing a reconnaissance variant and had drawn preliminary designs for a two-seat trainer version. None of these would fly. American intelligence officers documented the Ni-20 engine with considerable interest. The engine represented a genuine Japanese engineering achievement, developed largely without access to the German hardware that had guided European jet development. Its centrifugal design was less sophisticated than the axial flow turbojets the Germans and British had produced, but it worked, and it had been engineered by a team operating under conditions that would have paralyzed most industrial programs. The first prototype Kika was shipped to the United States for evaluation, It eventually found its way to the National Air and Space Museum's storage facility, where it remains today as the sole surviving example, kept largely out of public view for many decades before restoration work began to preserve it properly. What the Kika represented, stripped of wartime propaganda and post-war mythology, was something genuinely significant. It was not a war winner. Its performance was substantially below what the Mi-262 had demonstrated in combat over Europe. Its engines were unreliable by the standards that operational deployment would have demanded. Its pilots would have needed extensive retraining for jet operations. And Japan had no infrastructure to support that conversion program at scale. Production plans called for over 100 aircraft initially, with projections for far greater numbers if the program proved successful. But those plans existed on paper in a country where steel was being sourced from temple bells and schoolgirls were collecting pine roots to produce aviation fuel substitutes. The gap between planning documents and industrial reality had become a chasm. And yet, the Kika was real. It flew. In a nation that had been devastated by 4 years of industrial war against an adversary with resources it could not match. A team of engineers working in tunnels and dispersed workshops, rationing materials, improvising solutions to problems that European programs had taken years to solve with full industrial support. These men built a jet aircraft from near scratch and got it into the air. Susumu Takaoka climbed into a cockpit on August 7, 1945, and flew a machine that had no precedent in Japanese aviation history. The engineers who built it, Matsumura Ono, and the dozens of technicians whose names history has not preserved as carefully as it should, had accomplished something that deserves more than a footnote. The cave in Nagano. The flickering lights. The tunnels filled with the sound of men trying to build the future of a country that was already running out of time. Japan's last jet never reached the front. It never dropped a bomb. It never intercepted a B-29. But it existed. And in the specific, unforgiving accounting of engineering history, existence is everything.